Now I'm welcoming our first guest speakers, Professor Peter Turchin and Dr. Dan Hoyer. Do we have them on the screen already? Perhaps I would say some words to Professor Peter Turchin. Around the turn of last year, I think it was in December, I read an article in The Atlantic, and it was called "The Next Decade Could Be Even Worse." And the subtitle was, "A historian believes that he has discovered the iron laws that predict the rise and the fall of societies." I was deeply impressed about this article. It was a completely new way of thinking, but based on big data. Professor Turchin is professor at the University of Connecticut in the departments of ecology and evolutionary biology, anthropology, and mathematics. He is also a research associate in the School of Anthropology at the University of Oxford. And his colleague, Dr. Dan Hoyer, he received his PhD at New York University, and he currently holds a postdoctoral position with working with Dr. Peter Turchin on the topic Deep Roots of the Modern World. And he is part of the CSHAT project, the Global History Data Bank project, a large-scale interdisciplinary and comparative project hosted by the Evolution Institute and the University of Oxford. Peter and Dan, I welcome you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Thomas. And thank you to the organizers for organizing this conference. Let me share my screens. First, hopefully, you can see now the title slide. I also want to mention that I have just started in September my new job as the project leader of social complexity and collapse at the Complexity Science Hub in Vienna, Austria. And I am right now in this lovely city of Vienna, which is not very far from where you organizers are located. All right, so what I would like to do is to start with two questions that the organizers have posed to us. The first question, which is also the topic of today's session, is democracies, failing systems or renewable? My answer is both. It turns out, and this is what I will be talking about in the next 10 minutes or so, is that all complex human societies, including modern democracies, go through recurrent cycles of crisis and recovery. So this is one general macro-historical pattern that we see in the data that we have in the very large data set that we have collected. So this means that we are right now in Western democracies. We are actually in that phase where, which may be called pre-crisis phase. And that means that if we want to avoid our system to fail, we need to take certain steps. And that is my answer to the second question. Why is change needed? Over the past few decades, the pressures for instability, I'll be talking about them in a minute, have been increasing on the rise in liberal democracies of Europe and North America. So we need to change our political systems to make the looming crisis, which has become unavoidable. We are in the crisis, but we want to make it less severe, and we want to make recovery more certain. So let me unpack a little bit on this. I'll use as an example one of the examples that we have worked over the past 15 or 20 years, and this is United States. So what I'm doing in this graph, I'm looking at certain indices or proxies that indicate the state of the social system in the United States from the start of the Republic, 1780, to about 2010, when this analysis was completed. First of all, take a look at the blue curve. The blue curve is an integral measure that combines a number of proxies for well-being, economic proxies such as real wages, biological proxies such as life expectancies, and social proxies. And so what you can see, these are the recurrent cycles that I've been talking about of integrative cycles when the well-being increases and disintegrative cycles when the well-being declines. So right now, what you see is that there was a peak of well-being in the early 19th century, and during the most of the 19th century, the well-being was declining. And so what you see is the red curve is the empirically based model that we build that captures the pressures for crisis that I was talking about in the previous slide. You can see that pressures for crisis started to grow after, roughly speaking, 1840, and then hit a very high level in 1860. And not coincidentally, that's when the American Civil War happened. Now today, or rather by 2010, when I was studying this, I became very worried because I saw that for actually several decades in the United States, the well-being indices were declining. And when we plug the numbers into the model, we see that the red curve was rising. So 11 years ago, in February 2010, on the request of the science journal Nature, I published a short article where I made this prediction for the next decade, the decade of between 2010 and 2020. And I said it based on our understanding of how history operates and the data that we see currently in the United States and Western Europe, we see that the pressures for instability will be growing. So we expect a period of growing instability and reaching a peak in early 2020s, actually. All right, so 10 years after that, in January of 2020, together with my co-worker Andrei Koretaev, we decided to revisit this forecast and to see how well or how poorly it has been capturing what has been happening since then. So here on this graph, I'm showing you just one of the indices of instability. These are anti-government demonstrations in 6 major Western countries: US, Great Britain, France, Italy, and Spain. And you can see that here is 2010, the broken line, which is when the forecast was published. At that point, the instability has been declining. And by the way, you have other indices such as violent riots, terrorism events, and things like that. And all these indices were declining after 2010. So our forecast was not a linear extrapolation. Our forecast was actually saying that there is going to come a change in the nature of how our societies operate. And so what we see that the forecast, unfortunately, has come true because in all the major European and countries and North American countries, the various indices of instability, including this one, have been increasing. Now, that paper was submitted in January 2020, just before we realized what was going to happen with COVID. And of course, we did not at that time know that what was going to happen in summer of 2020, and especially on January 6th of this year. So this is the a photograph from the infamous storming of the US Capitol. So at this point, it is becoming abundantly clear to pretty much all that we are in crisis. I don't have much time to talk about the science underlying the forecast. Let me just say that there are three major internal forces that drive the pressures for political instability. Popular immiseration, which is the opposite of well-being, is one I've talked about already. Elite overproduction is a very important and very poorly understood and least appreciated forces for the instability. Basically, elite overproduction results when the elite numbers and the expected quality of life increase to the point where they basically overwhelm, they exceed the ability of the society to sustain them. When you start having too many elite aspirants for a single position, and that leads to spiraling inter-elite competition and conflict, and that undermines the stability and resilience of our societies in a major way. And then state fragility, somebody mentioned already the loss of confidence in state institutions. And so that's one big thing, legitimacy crisis. The other side of state breakdown is the fiscal crisis. And of course, international environment has also effect. No country is an island. This is as much as I want to talk about this drivers for stability. Let me just throw one slide that shows graphically how the quality of life has been changing over the past a century or so. So this is a graph from the Social Capital Project that looked at so-called deaths of despair, which integrate suicide rates, alcohol-related deaths, and drug overdoses. So the top gray curve is the sum of these things. And you can see that back in the beginning of the 20th century, we started pretty high with this index of misery. And then it declined, and roughly around 1960 started increasing again. So this is a relevant proxy, this is one of the proxies that goes into the well-being, or rather anti-well-being index. So you can see that this was one of the reasons why back in 2010, when the rise was already visible, I became very worried. So I think I will stop at this point and pass it over to my colleague, Dan Holler. I just want to mention that obviously in the 10 minutes that I had, I could not give justice to this theory and the data we have collected, but here are some of the books that you can consult, including the very prescient book by Jack Goldstone published in 1991, and two books of myself with some co-authors that developed further the theory and brought masses of data. And then we'll talk about our current efforts and also about the future. So I'll stop sharing. Yeah, over to you, Dan.
Great. And I will start sharing my screen now, which will hopefully work. Yep. So hopefully you can all see this and it is working all right. Yeah, so as Peter mentioned, we've been doing a lot of work trying to document these trends and seeing how they play out in real historical cases. And this then leads to the main question that we're sort of here to talk about is, can politics, can these dynamics, can these trends that we've identified actually be disrupted? Can you do anything once they sort of start going to stop it? And there's a couple different ways to look at this. I think, a lot of prominent scholars will take a fairly pessimistic view at this answer, and they say, well, not really. And only with some major catastrophe by some serious violent shock that has a lot of deaths, a lot of population loss, can you kind of reset the situation, right? As Walter Scheidel, the famous historian, calls it, death, the sort of violence, is the great leveler. That's really the only thing that can reset these crisis phases through things like warfare, massive revolution, state failure, some pandemic or famine or some catastrophic event that sort of resets the situation. And unfortunately, there is in sort of the historical and even recent records a lot of evidence that would kind of support this view that in many cases it is only as the result of some catastrophe. But if you look sort of closer at the actual data and at the actual historical cases, you do find some interesting patterns. What we find, as Peter mentioned, is that the entry into these crisis phases, if you look at various places around the world at various times, not just recent, not just Western European and American democracies, but other forms of society as well, we find that the entry into crisis is fairly stereotypical, following the different elements, the various factors that Peter just laid out. These tend to be the same forces that lead into crisis in all of the cases that we're looking at. As you can see here, this is just a sort of hypothetical reconstruction of how this plays out. As Peter showed, collective well-being tends to decline, these forces build up, the pressures build up, leading to this sort of crisis situation. But once that occurs, it turns out that the outcomes are actually fairly diverse. That yes, in many cases, it's sort of catastrophic, cascading violence, there's social collapse, there's maybe lingering instability, but there's also some resilience and some recovery that we can document as well. And this leads us to what we describe as the ginkgo leaf kind of model of crisis and recovery, where there's a fairly narrow range of factors that lead societies into crisis, but a very diverse range of outcomes from those crisis situations. And a lot of our work, currently the focus of our research is trying to document different cases in the past and more contemporary of societies that are experiencing these kinds of crisis and what actually happens to them. So this is just a graph that shows our sort of preliminary look at the number of actual societies who have experienced crisis and how severe are the outcomes of that crisis on a scale ranging from, sort of no violence, real resilience in the system, nothing major catastrophic happens, to the more severe end of the scale. Unfortunately, as you see, most of the cases do tend to cluster in the fairly severe, where you have a lot of assassinations, you have violent protests, as Peter mentioned, massive population loss in many cases, civil war, and in some extreme cases, even full societal collapse. But the good news is that there are examples on the other end of the spectrum, the less severe outcomes, or maybe there are mass protests, there are some demonstrations, but they're relatively peaceable. And resilience is sort of restored, or recovery happens through institutional reform rather than massive violence or loss of life. Just to give a very quick example, again, going back to the US over the last couple hundred years, as Peter mentioned, they've actually experienced both ends of this spectrum. You can see here, again, going from 1800 just to about 1950, you can track PSI, which is, again, this political stress index, this sort of composite measure of how severe are the forces that are leading towards crisis. And you can see, again, throughout the 19th century, as Peter mentioned, these pressures were building and they were rising. And as they rose, as they became sort of severe, in 1860, you saw the sort of violent outcome of this. And this is a very typical, historically, this kind of partisan fighting, this civil warfare, very large scale violence as the result of this increasing pressure. What we find in the US case is that the Civil War didn't actually resolve a lot of the pressure. It kept sort of building. High inequality, especially in the sort of burgeoning industrial cities in the North and the East, sort of kept this pressure mounting. But in the end of the 19th century and through the early 20th century, as we saw one of these less severe outcomes. So instead of another round of civil war, another round of major violence, we saw instead, yes, there were protests, there were anti-government rallies, there was some violence, but the pressure was relieved largely through regulation, institutional reform, things like antitrust regulation, wage protections, safety protections, various kinds of institutional reforms that lessened the popular immiseration and took some of the sting out of the elite overproduction and competition that Peter mentioned. And this actually did, we can track, do its job. It relieved a lot of the pressure. You can see the pressure declining throughout the first half of the 20th century. And this, of course, is related to the rise of well-being, as Peter showed during that same period. And there are a few other examples where the pressure was relieved not by major violence, but by peaceable institutional reform. The Roman Republic, the so-called crisis of the orders in the 4th century BCE is a good example. England during the 1830s, which saw a lot of similar institutional labor type reforms. Russia in 1860 underwent a similar process. There are, in other words, examples of less severe outcomes. And this leads to this sort of more optimistic view, which is what Peter and I and our colleagues try to focus on. Taking sort of hope in the fact that crises do vary in their severity in terms of the outcomes from them, that yes, often and maybe in most cases, societies do descend into violence, chaos, and even collapse when they get into one of these crisis situations. But nevertheless, there are examples of societies being able to maintain resilience, being able to reform themselves and reorganize to recover quickly and peaceably. And this gives us hope that we can identify some of the so-called leverage points that will allow us to tip and navigate the course of a crisis to go from the more severe towards the less severe. And just to sort of wrap up what we've been talking about, and again, the focus of a lot of our current research, is we think we have, as Peter mentioned, uncovered a lot of the major structural causes of various ages of discord and these periods of crisis. Declining population well-being, growing discontent, elite overproduction, as Peter mentioned, is one of these major driving forces. And in the past, of course, these structural conditions do usually end with major outbreaks of violence. And this is no longer a forecast, as Peter mentioned. This is our reality. We are currently in a state of crisis or one of these ages of discord in many Western democratic societies. But as history teaches us, the outcome is not set in stone. We can still navigate towards, we can make reforms that can allow us to experience somewhat less severe outcomes than has existed in the past. Thank you all very much for your attention. I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Peter and Dan, for this great talk. There's a lot of talk about crises, but very nice to hear that there's also an optimistic view. About the optimistic view, I'm going to go over to our first question from the audience. Darian asks, first of all, Darian says, thank you for a great talk, and asks, what is your advice to politics and politicians on how to avert, minimize the impact of the coming age of discord #2?
This is a great question, and something we do talk about a lot. You know, we try to avoid giving sort of specific advice. There's no sort of magic, you know, silver bullet that can sort of solve everyone's crisis in the same way. It totally depends on the particular context of the different societies. What we have been able to identify, and again, one of the reasons that we do take this view of trying to uncover the main driving forces that lead to the pressures that result in crisis, is to identify some of the key factors that are involved. And as Peter mentioned, you know, inequality stands out as a major force, or at least a major sign of things going wrong. And so efforts to reduce inequalities stand out as a major goal here, whatever that happens to be, whether it's redistributive, whether it's investing in different welfare programs that can raise popular immiseration and sort of alleviate some of that pressure. Those are certainly central. But as Peter mentioned, I think one of the aspects that gets under-recognized or underserved is the fact that the sort of partisanship, the factional infighting among elites, the elite competition itself, nothing can really be resolved unless that is addressed as well. And that's a lot tougher. That requires, you know, efforts to expand the field, to expand opportunities, to reduce some of the pressure to make opportunities more inclusive, to reduce some of the, let's say, pressure of upward social mobility in a way, and the more sort of, let's say, social, psychological efforts that need to reconcile groups that are become accustomed to being hostile and to being in conflict with each other. You have to resolve those tensions. And that's not easily done, but it is possible.
Yeah, just to add to that, it's also, we need a shift in our collective social psychology. Because one general lesson we learned from the previous crisis is that the crises are ended by increased social cooperation, both between rulers and elites and common people and within different elite groups. So any kind of ideologies that divide people are actually the feed that make crisis worse, and vice versa. The reconciliation between different factions is how those crises end in a more positive way. So it's really to deal with our crisis. We have to do some hard-nosed things, like Dan mentioned, reducing inequality and bringing into balance the numbers of people for positions and the supply of those positions. But also there is this sort of soft sciencey part of it. We need to change our social attitudes.
Touching on the thing about infighting between the elites, we have one question asking to elaborate just a little bit on what the overproduction of elite is.
Yeah, so I mean, as as Peter mentioned, this is sort of central to a lot of the theoretical perspectives that we take. In essence, in sort of simple terms, it is a supply and demand story that a number of people who sort of attain, or at least hope to attain, top positions, whether this is economic positions, whether this is political leadership, whatever these sort of positions of authority and prestige are, there tends to be more people who are vying for these positions than there are positions available. And simple supply and demand, there is an oversupply, an overproduction of elites and elite aspirants, and a sort of fairly static or inelastic number of positions available. And that just leads to intense competition, that leads to a lot of frustrated ambitions, which, as Peter mentioned, is psychologically damaging, that leads to frustration, that leads to disengagement with sort of social cohesion, and tends to exacerbate factional differences and conflict between groups.
Yeah, and let me just add to that, a concrete example of that is when we look at political elites in the United States. So the elite aspirants are those who want to be elected to the Senate, Congress, president, and so on positions. Well, there is a very strange, perverse dynamic that has occurred over the past 30 or 40 years. As the real wages relative to GDP of workers have declined, the fruits of economic labor went to employers. And so that's why we see the explosion of wealth. And now some proportion of those people with newly acquired wealth, they decided to turn it into political office. We know many examples of wealthy people who run for office in the United States. And so suddenly you have lots of millionaires competing for the same 100 Senate seats, 435 seats in the House, one president. All right. And so what we saw in the last, since 2016, right, elections, we've seen the results of such extreme competition when social norms of behavior begin to start to unravel. The inter-elite infighting, mostly verbal at this point, but it has already become more and more violent. So this is an example of how elite overproduction, so in this particular case, overproduction of wealthy candidates for public office, how it unravels democracies.
Thank you for that very clear and elaborative answer to that question. For our next question, we have an anonymous user asking, I understand you see discord ahead for the West, the US and Europe. What about Asia and China? Where are they at?
I'll let Peter answer that. I think there are some similar troubling signs. They seem to be a little bit behind the sort of cycles, but there are some similar signs. Again, the structure of the political and, say, economic realities in a place like China or even in a place like Japan are different than in the US. And so the nature of who gets to be an elite aspirant is different. But regardless, as sort of wealth accrues and as inequality is driving in a place like China, certainly you do see signs of the same kind of competition and infighting that Peter's talking about.
Yeah, well, actually, what I would like to add is that in order to make the type of forecast that you saw for the United States, we also have a group of our colleagues have done the same for the United Kingdom. But to do it for China, for example, we need to do a massive amount of work, collect, dozens of different indicators, make sense of them, and feed them into our empirically based model. We're actually doing that. We have our team has been joined by a postdoc who is collecting this type of data, and so just in an arm-wavy way, what we can say is that China has exited its previous crisis, right, much later than the United States or Western Europe. So whereas in the United States and Western Europe, the last big crisis was the revolution, the Great Revolutions of 19th century, 1848, 1870, and so on and so forth. China has left its crisis, its century of humiliation, only in 1970 or so. So it's behind the cycle, and we will know more in about a year or so, but it looks like their next wave of instability they would have to deal with is decades ahead. But again, take this with a grain of salt.
Okay, thank you for that. Our next question is from Darian, who posed the first question, and this is concerning direct democracy. He asks, do you think more direct democracy is a cure or a recipe for collapse? As complex questions are perhaps not best addressed by swarm, I'll reformulate that, intelligence or unintelligence.
I know that the focus of a lot of this conference, a lot of this is on democracy. It's in my mind, and I don't know if you agree with this, Peter, in my mind, it's a bit of a secondary question. Direct democracy, the processes of political engagement and inclusion are a factor, but they're not the main driving factor. And really, it's the other sort of structural components are going to mediate how that works. And so, to take sort of concrete example, a direct democracy in a society that is experiencing integrative phase, as Peter talked about, where well-being tends to be high, where there's a lot of social cohesion, where there's not a lot of animosity between the forces, that can work great. That can be an accelerant to responding to things and to boosting resiliency. But the same political systems, the same democratic engagement in a context that is in a disintegrative phase, where you see pressures are high, where you see tensions are high, factions have formed, that's just going to sort of exacerbate those and give a forum for these sort of tensions and these sort of conflicts to play out, and can even accelerate the spiral into violence. And so really, it's not a matter of the technologies or the institutions themselves, it's how do those institutions play out given the larger structural contexts.
Okay, thank you for that answer. Sadly, our time is over, even though we still have a lot of questions, but we need to get moving to the next speakers.